I'm going to talk to you a little bit about imperialism today. The issue of imperialism is fraught. The term itself is often denied. It's not given a room in our public discussion. Even in the left, there are corners that make light of the existence of imperialism, making light of the way the world is organized. Very quickly, imperialism has perhaps several meanings, comes to us from a tradition now over 100 years ago. But very basically, here's a thumbnail definition. In political terms, imperialism refers to the denial of sovereignty of certain nations. There is a kind of geography of imperialism. We typically mark it out these days along the axis of the north and the south, although things are, of course, more complicated than that. But nonetheless, the first point is that imperialism is the political aspect of denying the sovereignty of certain nations. So, certain nations deny the sovereignty of other nations. Economically, there's also, of course, an important aspect here, and it is related to the political. In other words, the sovereignty of certain nations is denied insofar as those nations might attempt, for instance, to get better royalties, get better rents for the raw materials, and so on that are extracted and exported out of those nations. So one is the suppression of the price of primary goods, primary commodities from certain parts of the world. Related to that is the suppression of wages in these parts of the world. We have ample examples of this. I'm not going to get into that now, but I want to just emphasize that the way in which, at least I understand the concept of imperialism, is it explains the denial of political sovereignty to some parts of the world. That denial comes along the axes of many different kinds of suppression: military suppression, diplomatic suppression, economic, financial suppression through sanctions and so on, social and then cultural suppression. Also, of course, as I said, the economic aspect, which is the denial of these very nations the right to claim larger amounts of the surplus in terms of prices of export of primary goods, and then suppression of wages. I think that's pretty much sums up the concept of imperialism in the abstract. Now, let's look at this a little bit historically to understand the contemporary position. To do this, I'm going to basically go over about 5 points. These are historical moments since 1991, and I hope they clarify a little bit about how I believe imperialism functions today. The first point is unipolarity. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist state system in Eastern Europe, we saw the emergence of the United States claiming a position of first among equals. This was a position denied to the United States after World War II, when the US State Department said that the point of US power was to seek preponderance. That was the articulated objective of US power right after World War II, and that power was denied by the existence of the Soviet Union, the communist state system in Eastern Europe, and to an extent as well the Third World Project, including the non-aligned movement as its main political flank. This denial of US primacy collapsed with the Third World debt crisis when Mexico went bankrupt first, and then other countries in the early 1980s. And then it, of course, was perfectly allowed when the Soviet Union and the communist state system collapsed. So we had the era of unipolarity opening up in around 1990-91. That lasts till about 2013, 2015 or thereabouts. Two events define the emergence of unipolarity. The first being a set of events having to do with military power, and there we have the US war on Iraq 1991, all the way to the breakup of Yugoslavia 1999. And then on the economic side, the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1994. Russia was deeply weakened when the Soviet Union collapsed. It in fact joined the G7, making it the G8, and it became a NATO partner of peace. This is under both Boris Yeltsin from 1991 to 1999, and then from Vladimir Putin from 1999 onwards. At the same time, China under Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao from 1993 to 2013 essentially played a very careful game, inserted itself, or at least its labor, into the world capitalist system, and then didn't really rock the boat of the US dominated international system. Okay, so the first point is the emergence of unipolarity, where the US was, in a sense, unblocked. Second, we see a so called signal crisis. This term comes to us from Giovanni Arrighi, from whom I'm borrowing it. We saw by the early 2000s, rather quickly, a decade after unipolarity had been established, we saw that the US had overreached by at least two ways. One is through over leveraging its own domestic economy, over leveraging banks, its non-productive assets and so on. And secondly, by trying to fight several wars at once. This is really made clear by the global war on terror. The actual signal crisis for the weakness of US power was the Iraq War of 2003 on the political side, and then on the economic side, let's call it what it was, the Great Depression, which starts in 2007-08. We see these two signal crises indicating that unipolarity had its limits. The third point, we see the rise in the second decade of the 2000s of both China and Russia. Now, China's emergence has several legs. One is the domestic economy begins to flourish. Don't have time to get into that, but it's just a fact that the growth rate is very high. And secondly, in 2013, China announces the Belt and Road Initiative and attempts a kind of global project that rivals the International Monetary Fund. Russia also has a development, an emergence, re-emergence on two legs. First, Putin, who took over from Boris Yeltsin after the world depression, it's sometimes called the Great Recession, but really is a depression. Putin fought off sections of the oligarchs to assert state control over sections of the economy. Didn't change the basis of the economy, but some sections he brought into control. And secondly, Russia twice exerted itself outside its borders, first in Crimea in 2014 and then in Syria in 2015. This is the first military challenge to the United States since the fall of the USSR. So China and Russia also deepen their own cooperation with each other. That's a significant fact. Number 4, the United States begins to articulate what you can call a global Monroe Doctrine. That means that the whole world is effectively under US dominion. Very important that they begin to say by around 2018 that the global war on terror is over, and now the point of US power is essentially to hold back, to suffocate the emergence of what are called near-peer rivals, Russia and China. And anything can be done there, including the use of intermediate nuclear weapons, which is why the United States withdraws in 2018-2019 from the Intermediate Nuclear Weapons Treaty, just destroying the arms control regime. A major confrontation is put together against China and Russia. We generally call that the new Cold War, kind of hybrid war, pressure placed on Russia and China, attempting to isolate them, break them, and as US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said recently, to weaken Russia. Liz Truss, UK Foreign Secretary, also talked about weakening China. We see that this is a good example of imperialism. That is to say, two powers, major powers in Eurasia, attempting to assert themselves even modestly, not a direct frontal challenge to the United States, but a challenge at US borders, challenge over who gets dominion over Europe. In other words, United States frustrated that Russia and China making inroads into integration of Eurasia. That was unacceptable. And so, in a way, the war in Ukraine is actually caught up in all these things where the United States seeks to integrate Europe into an Anglo American project through NATO rather than to allow Europe to integrate into Eurasia. And Ukraine gets caught up in this. Obviously, there's much more to the war in Ukraine. What is imperialism? Imperialism is just this, it's the attempt to suffocate other countries, prevent them from rising up, near peer rivals, and so on and so forth. It's pretty incumbent upon people of goodwill, sensitive people, people of the left, to chart out a different path than this kind of confrontationist logic. We need a new kind of non aligned movement. We need a new kind of movement that says peace must stand ahead of militarism. The world has spent, largely the West, by the way, over $2 trillion in arms. That's unacceptable. We need to be spending that kind of money to deal with the climate catastrophe, to deal with hunger, to deal with the other obstinate facts of history. That's where that money should be going, not towards more arms, more confrontation, and so on. Imperialism is expensive for humanity, very expensive. We need to get out of this. We have to set it aside for the sake of humanity. Thanks a lot.